Episode 141, How to Become a Podcast Guest.
Welcome to the PR Playbook Podcast, the only podcast giving you actionable skills and advice you need to execute a strategic PR program. Warning: what you hear next may lead to brand awareness and increased sales and customer exposure. Now here's your host, Ronjini Joshua.
Welcome to episode 141. Sometimes I'm losing count here, guys. We're getting deep into the hundreds. I love it. But today we're going to talk about how to become a podcast guest. And so I'm sure you've heard some of the interviews that I've done. And I've actually also been on several other podcasts and been a guest myself. And that's something that is increasingly becoming more common and a key factor for thought leadership is to be on these podcasts that are relevant to your specific industry. And so today we're just going to talk about some of the things you might need to have in place. There are definitely some podcast placement agencies and they're fun. Basically, they are micro PR agency. Maybe they probably won't like me saying this. They're like micro PR agencies because PR agencies can do the same thing. They should be able to place you on podcasts, but they're probably a little bit more focused and niched on podcasts, maybe know the producers a little bit better. But all these podcasts have submission processes, and it's all about your clout and kind of how visible you are. So when you're doing podcasts, remember not to just focus on doing podcasts, but also writing and speaking in other places and being a part of conferences and doing webinars. Like all of that stuff is going to actually help you get more podcast placements because they want to know that your voice is listenable, right? They want to know that you are personable on a podcast. You can kind of go back and forth, and the way you speak really has to show that you have some kind of expertise and thought leadership. So as you choose podcasts to identify and be a part of, just remember that you're adding value to the podcast. Just like when we're doing contributed articles, you're adding value for that publication. Just like when you're doing media interviews, you're adding value for the journalists. So make sure that you are adding value. So the first thing I want to talk about is identifying the podcast. So this actually plays a huge part because you're really looking at your customer. Like, who is your customer? Or who are you trying to reach with podcasts? So either you're trying to elevate your industry voice, like let's say you're an engineer and you want to be on some engineering podcasts and you want to show that you have that expertise, or you are trying to get customers. So new customers, finding podcasts that have your particular target audience as their customer base or their listenership. And then you might just want to be kind of getting out there and talking about different parts of your life. Some people want to talk about entrepreneurship or they want to talk about their startup journey. And that's just kind of establishing your personal brand, right? So there's multiple reasons. So there you're establishing and elevating your professional brand as far as the company that you work with. You're establishing and elevating your personal brand as far as yourself, right? And then the last thing was the expert thought leadership, where you're really kind of fine tuning and cultivating that expertise that you might have. Obviously, for me, it's public relations. For somebody else, it could be like AI or machine learning, or it could be engineering, or, we work with a company called Quad9. So it could be DNS or cybersecurity. So things like that really come into play. So make sure you understand which podcasts, how to choose podcasts based on what target audience you want to focus in on. Okay. So that's kind of how you start doing that. And another way to easily do that, a lot of ways we do it is using competitive analysis. So, right, if you find a couple of your competitors or people that you admire or people that you want to be like, and you look up what podcasts they've been on, that's a really nice and easy way to kind of identify those podcasts. Identifying your podcast is the first step. Secondly, you need to create a podcast profile. So this is a little bit different than a bio, and we have a special way of doing this. So it does include a bio of yourself and your background and expertise, especially as it relates to what you want to talk about. I always include a high resolution picture, which means 300 DPI or more. And then I like to outline maybe 3 to 4 topics that you are championing that season, right? So you want to talk about like, hey, I really want to talk about climate change, or I am really passionate about ESG and corporate initiatives, or I'm focused on machine learning and how it's impacting sustainable cities. So be as specific as possible in these 3 to 5 points, 3 to 4 or 5 points that you want to champion. And these are the kind of what I say, these are the themes of what you want to talk about in each podcast. And depending on which podcast you're reaching out to, you're going to put the ones that are most relevant to them at the top and maybe some other ones at the bottom. So pick some topics you want to talk about. That's number 2 on your profile. Number 3 on your profile is having examples. So if you don't have other podcasts that you've already been featured on, maybe you want to add some of your writing. You could just record something as well. Like there you have YouTube. YouTube is an amazing, right? A platform. So you could record a few pieces talking about different things in your company, different expertise that you might have, different trends that you might have, but you can kind of point them to other places that you've spoken. I usually like to include links like, here's an article we wrote. Here's another podcast we were featured in, or I spoke at this. So I like to have 3 to 4 references of where you've spoken or provided your expertise in the past to show that you have experience in that. And that way it covers all the bases. They know a little bit about you, they know about what you want to talk about, and then they can see where you've done that before. So that's really important. So this podcast profile is really like the jumping point to getting secured on any podcast. So the next step is really finding the producer. You can use Muckrack, which is our tool that we use, Incision, but of course that's a little bit costly if you're not in the public relations field and if you're just doing this on your own. So the other thing is if you find a podcast, you can literally just say the PR Playbook podcast producer. I don't have a producer. I am my own producer. Me and Ben and Aaron, we work on the podcast. So for us it's really simple, and I always give you guys my email. So it's obviously good to listen to the podcast cuz they might give you contact information in there. But typically if it's a bigger podcast, you can type in the name in Google and say producer, and you should be able to find that. If you can't find the producer, you can find the host. The first place I would go is a podcast's homepage. So whether it's like for us, and we are on Buzzsprout, but then we're also on Apple, we're on Spotify, we're on Amazon, and I think our contact information is pretty much everywhere. If it's not, it should be. And then I mentioned my contact. I mean, you can look me up and you could find me like you know, you could in the distance of throwing a brick, like I'm everywhere. But that should be a way for you guys to find who's managing the schedule. So it's usually the producer who's managing the schedule. Sometimes there's someone called a scheduler. That person is doing schedule. Oftentimes, like if you're dealing with broadcast, it'll be like guest relations, could be another title. So these are all things that you can look for as far as finding the contact person. And then the last step in this is pitching yourself. So obviously your profile is going to be one thing, but the pitch itself is going to be something a little bit more specific. And you could say, hey, look, guys, I'm just making up a name. Shelly, I'd really love to be on the podcast. We are the future. And the reason I'd like to be on the podcast is because I'd love to talk about one of these 3 topics. If these sound interesting to you, I would love to I'd love to get on your schedule. Attached is my profile. You can learn a little bit more about me there. Or here's my LinkedIn. You can find something about, and I would actually maybe even put your podcast profile uploaded to your LinkedIn as a document so that people can find it there too. So that's the pitch, right? You want to make it personal and personalized as well. You want them to know that you know who they are and what they talk about on their podcast. And I would do a follow-ups within a couple of maybe 3 days. Podcast hosts usually take longer to get back to you, so I would say 2 or 3 days, and I would follow up 3 times. And you know what? If they don't book you now, don't not try again. Maybe boomerang that email and try again in a few months. Because sometimes they don't respond because they're like booked out for that season. And some podcasts, that's something else to know is sometimes podcasts book for seasons and sometimes they book for the whole year. Sometimes they book in like monthly or quarterly time frames. So for me, a lot of times I'll look at all the profiles that come in. And one, obviously, if it's a match is the first decision that I make. Are you a match for my podcast? And then the second thing is, okay, if they're a match, is that something that I want to book right now? I kind of figure out, okay, what episode should that person be? I'm at 141. Maybe that topic isn't really something I want to talk about till episode 150. And so that's something else you have to think about their decision making process. So maybe your topic isn't timely for them. And that's like any other pitch, right? So don't be afraid to try again if you feel like you're a really good fit for that particular podcast. And then what else can I tell you about podcast pitching and booking? Once you do book it, like if they do want to book you, respond quickly. Like, make it easy for them to have you on as a guest. Things you can ask for, questions in advance or pre call sometimes. I don't usually do pre calls. I do my pre call right before we record because it doesn't take much. As you guys know, this is pretty conversational. So I usually talk to them about if I don't know them or if I do know them. Sometimes I know who I'm talking to, or I actually select the people to be on the show. And then sometimes they're actually incoming. So that's the other thing. If the podcast host already has like an idea of who they want to be a guest, maybe they're not picking out new people and they don't always respond. That's just life. So don't feel offended and that's the other thing. Rejection is a thing. So don't feel offended. But yeah, just keep trying again. It just could be like a time issue. So I think I've given you, I don't know if I even finished my previous thought, but I hope I've given you guys enough to start reaching out to podcasts, feel confident. The first couple podcasts are always going to be a little bit weird. You do not need a professional setup. There's usually I record on Google Meets. I have my equipment. That doesn't mean everybody else has to have equipment. So in this digital era, there's nothing holding you back from being on a podcast. And don't take yourself too seriously when you hear it back. Just remember that because nobody likes the way they sound the first few times. Last but not least, have a good photo. Have a good photo of yourself, a great headshot. And I would say have like a great regular headshot with like, your corporate professional headshot, but then also have like kind of a personality headshot because some of those podcasts like to have personality as well. So good luck, guys. If you have any other questions about podcasts, getting on a podcast, producing a podcast, any podcast questions, you can email me, Ronjini at thesilvertelegram.com. See what I did there with the contact info. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a great day and I will talk to you next time.